Today's guest is Gabriel Valles, a parent of two in Austin, Texas, who has explored a variety of education options for his kids, including homeschooling, microschooling, private schooling. He is also an education entrepreneur who created his own microschool. A feature film animator by training, Gabriel runs Mentor Wings Art, a studio giving kids professional level skills before they graduate from high school. Gabriel Valles, welcome to the LiberatED podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It's very good to be here.
It's very good to have you here. We've known each other for several years, connected, I guess, maybe 5 years ago through our kind of shared interest in homeschooling and unconventional education. We collaborated on a children's book project called A is for Abundance. So it's great to have you on the show today to talk about your perspectives as a parent, finding the right educational fit for your kids, particularly outside the conventional classroom. You have two children, an older child who's 21, who kind of went through unconventional education, a variety of different options, and a 15-year-old who's it's still in the process of going through K to 12 schooling and in an unconventional way. And you also are a founder who created not only your small business, Mentor Wings Art, but also a microschool kind of as part of this educational journey. So I want to talk about all of that. But let's start with, I guess, your oldest. What brought you to thinking about unconventional education in those early days?
Um, you know, Even before I had kids, I was already working with youth. I took them to camps when I was 19, and at 24, I actually founded a youth center here in Austin, Texas. Um, so I figured, I'm working with kids, so I should probably know something about education and, how they learn and things like that. So pretty early on, I was already reading about education and just exploring that just out of necessity. But I also just had a really horrible public school experience. I hated school. I tell people I hated school because I loved learning. I would always be in the library reading, just learning things. Had to teach myself art because I couldn't get the type of instruction that I needed in the traditional art classes. So I was just always in the library. Once I ran out of out of the art books, I traveled over the movie section and then to the history section, and I was just in our little public library in Midland, Texas. So education was always important to me, and I didn't realize until much after I left high school, that it wasn't my fault that I had such a horrible experience in high school. So I knew really early on that I didn't want that for my kids. So I started exploring all sorts of things, starting off with classical education. I was a big fan of C.S. Lewis. And so through that, I sort of found my way into classical education. So that's where we started. And then we just moved on as I was kind of seeing and observing Micah, our oldest, just not flourishing in certain environments, we just would make a change. So we were really quick to just change directions.
Yeah, so you started with a classical private school for
Yes.
him in his early days. And what was it that made you switch initially, and what did you switch to?
Well, being a fan of C.S. Lewis, just in his writing and his breadth of knowledge and wisdom, I wanted that for him. I thought that was a good direction to go. But what happened one day is that they were having a little science experiment, and he just became enamored with it, and he didn't want to leave. But then the school structure said, "Hey, we got to do the next thing now." And I started thinking, well, the science is being enamored by the subject. It's not moving on to the next thing so you can check off a bunch of boxes. Um, so I realized that this is probably not where he belongs. So the next year we started homeschooling after that. So it just became too close to what I experienced in public schools.
Yeah, so I mean, I think sometimes we forget that traditional schooling, public or private, often has the same playbook around kind of a top-down curriculum and a standardized approach to education, which is why so many more families are attracted to unconventional educational models that kind of don't follow that same playbook. So you switched over to homeschooling. I know there's a large homeschooling population in Texas. What were sort of your early days of homeschooling like? What was your educational approach?
Well, it was mostly my wife in charge of that. And um, she did really good in school, by the way, the opposite of me. So she did kind of have that. And I think, by the way, I think this is the big problem why we left Veritas or the classical school as well, is because I think a lot of adults have this public school mindset where this is just the way it happens. You have a teacher in front of the classroom, you give them curriculum, they do the work, and then you move on. So I think the early days of homeschooling were very similar. And to be honest, it wasn't working. It was a power struggle between my son and my wife. And then, and I was at work, so I didn't get to experience every day. But when I did experience it, I just realized that um Micah was putting the onus on my wife, which is what happens when you don't have a self-directed type of environment, is that all of a sudden you're not responsible for your own education. The person around you is responsible for that. So um, I literally told him, you are now in charge of your education. Your mom is not in charge of this anymore. So if you do the work, you do the work. If you don't, you'll suffer the repercussions of that. Um, and we were doing other little programs here and there. There was a place called One Day Academy where you could take a la carte classes. And so if he didn't do his work for that class, uh, he just was embarrassed. So basically, I just gave him full responsibility for his education pretty early on. I think he was maybe around 9 or something like that. So.
So then what happened as you kind of shifted into self-directed education and away from sort of traditional homeschooling?
Well, it took a while, so none of this is magic. So I don't want to like give the false impression that, I had the perfect answers. But eventually he did come to like take charge of his own education. He became very disciplined. He did his own work, and occasionally, there would be um, a little argument between mom and him. And I said, remember, you're in charge of your own education. This is just on you. It's not on mom. Um, so he's become very disciplined as a result, in the long run. So, uh,
Yeah, so he's an adult. He's now 21. What was kind of looking back on his K to 12 experience, shifting from private school to homeschooling to then more unschooling or self-directed education? What were kind of his later years as a self-directed learner like?
yeah. So we did a good stretch with homeschooling, but then I decided, again, he needs something more.
Mm.
And I was always a fan of Jeff Sandifer and his Acton school. I even applied to start a school. It was a different kind of model, low cost. They liked it, but it kind of competed with their other schools. So I just decided to start my own school. And I even asked them, hey, can you train me in your methods? And they said, no, we can't do that because of our franchisees. That wouldn't be fair. So what I did is I actually hired an Acton student to run a boot camp over the summer. And I was able to learn their entire process from an 11-year-old girl. She walked away with $300, and I had the entire school process kind of established. Who knows better than the students how the school runs? Um, so then I ran that school. It was called Mentor Wings Academy for a year. Um, and the reason I wasn't able to sustain it was because of it was a low cost school, and I just realized I can't afford to do this. Most of it was coming out of my pocket. Um, but through that experience, I learned quite a bit about uh, the students, the process of educating. For example, uh, when I first started, I was very heavily tied to the Acton model, but then I started adjusting because I had this very impressive 8-year-old girl who was reading college level books. She couldn't even spell, but she was reading the books. Um, and but turns out she was unschooled. Uh, and I was so impressed with her that I was like, oh wow, that is just a step further than what we're doing here, just with the self-directed curriculum. And so I just started adding more of that to the to the process. Uh, my school was kind of like a Frankenstein version of an Acton Academy because we had unschoolers and then we had parents who were um, uh, very stringent about, hey, my kids need to be doing this at this time. So we would have very studious kids over here, like doing what their parents wanted them to do, and then we have unschoolers over here doing their thing. Uh, but it was a good way to kind of see the different learning techniques in action. The funny thing is, the unschoolers started taking on some of the characteristics of the other students and vice versa. So they started kind of blending with each other. So we had some self-directed stuff, and then we had some direct instruction stuff that was kind of remote from the parents sending it with their kid from home. Um, the So for my son, it worked out really well because well, let me explain kind of the process. In the morning, we would have a Socratic discussion, which a lot of the students claim help them come out of their shells, help them become more articulate. And so that was a good exercise for a lot of the students. Most of them could speak really well after a year of Socratic discussions. And then we would have core studies, which are all the basics. We would use apps, and I just was looking and experimenting with as many different apps as possible, Khan Academy, all sorts of different math apps and history apps and spelling apps. So if they liked them, they would use them. If they didn't like them, they wouldn't. We would just move on. Um, and we had projects. So I think this was the biggest part of the school was the project. And the project for everyone was YouTube channels. It was already in their kind of wheelhouse, things that they did already, things that they loved. So, and I have a media background, so I understand the power of media. So, and a lot of them just already had the interest in it. So let's just do YouTube channels for everybody. So I had YouTube channels on coding, graphic design, shabby chic furniture, um, uh, baking, cooking. And my son, he started a stop motion animation channel. Um, and uh, and it was crazy because his started taking off. We had a little celebration when he got his first 100 subscribers, and then all of a sudden he's got 1,000 subscribers, and then 10,000 subscribers. So it just like took off like a rocket. And the funny thing is, he even though he was in this environment where he could just do anything, he would go and do his stop motion channel during project time, and some of the kids would get distracted with the students, but he just wanted to do his thing. He was into it. So we had locked in on what he's supposed to do pretty early on. Um, he started monetizing that channel at 12 years old. Um, so he's been collecting money from YouTube and Google for, uh, over 10 years now. So, um, and
And that's what he does now, Gabriel, as
that's what he
a
does now.
profession.
That's his,
Yeah,
yeah, that's his full-time job. He did
amazing.
end up taking a master class with Aardman Animation for 2 years. And so he just wanted to, I kind of suggested it at first, and he loved it. So I paid for the first year, he paid for the second year out of his YouTube money. But and that kind of solidified his confidence even more because now he's working with professional tools and he knows that he's capable of competing with professional level animators. So
Oh, that's just incredible. And shows sort of the power of self-directed education, following interests and passions.
yeah,
Um, and one thing you said I want to talk a little bit more about. You said that the Mentor Wings Academy was going well, but it was sort of unsustainable financially because of your commitment to a low-cost learning model.
right,
This was before the advent of school choice programs. Texas became one of more than a dozen states to implement universal eligibility around school choice. That happened earlier this year. But these school choice programs in Texas, at least, don't apply to microschools. They apply at the moment to sort of accredited private schools. But the idea in the states that have robust school choice programs, including universal programs that apply to microschools and homeschooling collaboratives and other kinds of innovative learning models, is that it sort of make these models more financially accessible to more families and more sustainable from an entrepreneur perspective. I wonder, what your thoughts are on that, and if you were in a state that had sort of universal eligibility for microschools and similar models, if that would have changed the equation a little bit for you.
yeah, it would have changed the equation because it would have doubled the amount of money we could make. So we could actually, yeah, it would have been sustainable at that point. We could have
Yeah,
just continued on doing what we are doing. Um, but we were working under the radar. We weren't accredited. We weren't
yeah,
doing anything. It was just me and 12 kids. Um, so that's another kind of issue. It's like, okay, how do you work unschooling into any of these environments?
yeah.
When they think you're just some random people uh, that aren't accredited, so
But again,
yeah,
in a lot of states like Arizona, Florida, they'll allow these universal programs allow kind of micro schools that are unaccredited to operate. Texas,
right.
unfortunately, doesn't yet, but hopefully that will change in the near future because I think it enables a lot of these experimental models to be more accessible so families can find just the right fit.
Yeah, and I was operating under the homeschool
Yeah,
rules.
yeah,
It's just, it's a private school.
yeah.
We're collaborating with different homeschool families. So I was able to use those rules to get insurance and things like that, and actually create the school. So there's creative
Nice.
ways to do this stuff. So
Yeah. So let's switch gears and talk about your now 15-year-old who's sort of
mhm.
in the mix, in the
Okay.
midst of K to 12 unconventional education. What has your 15-year-old's experience been like?
He started off with just a private kindergarten. You know, uh, my wife just wanted him to have the kindergarten experience, with a teacher, and first day of school photos and stuff like that. Just kind of the traditional stuff, which is fine. I'm all for anything that's not harmful. So, for example, we did classical conversations with Benny at one time, and they learn Latin, and I'm like, okay, well, you may or may not need Latin, but it's not harmful. So, and he enjoys it. He's got friends there. And that's the main reason he enjoyed it, is because of the friendships. So my kind of philosophy is, if it's not harmful and he's actually going to benefit, even if it's kind of tangentially with other things that he may not care about, but it's still educating you, then it's okay. Um, so he started off at traditional. He went homeschool for a little bit. Then he uh, went into classical conversations. Um, and now he's at a place called Alpha, which is pretty much in the news right now. And it's the AI powered school. Um,
Yeah, and I've had
so,
the founder, Mackenzie Price, on the podcast. So tell
okay,
us a
yeah.
little bit about Alpha School. What attracted you?
Well, it was very similar to what I was doing at Mentorings Academy, so I'm familiar with that model. And I'm also familiar with the idea that it's going to be changing. Alpha's still fairly new relatively. So even though they've had their first batch of graduates, they're still kind of changing from year to year, it just to try to improve constantly. And that's what I was doing. I was able to just switch gears based on on the input I was getting from the students and the parents. And I can see that they're doing that as well. The main reason we wanted Benny to go there is because it was similar to what I was doing, but also he just needs community. He's not like my oldest where he'll just like go in and do his thing, and just go in and make his videos. He just needs to be surrounded by a group of people and he needs the community. He needs the encouragement and the accountability from everybody. I just saw it and I just knew that was the best place for him. So I just started looking into it. And turns out the guy that helped me start my Mentor Wings Academy was a co-founder of Alpha. So it just all started tying in together. And Alpha is kind of an outshoot of the Acton Academy model, completely readjusted and changed at this point. Um, but it's kind of has the same origins.
Yeah,
Um,
so sort of aligned with your educational vision and values, and something that your individual child, needs and wants. I think that that's sort of the beauty of this emerging educational space with all of these microschools and different learning models is that there's increasingly a marketplace, right? That families are able to find just what they're looking for each of their kids, and they
right.
don't need to settle for something that isn't working. Is
Yes.
that your sense as well, where we are?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and going back to my school, the Mentor Wings Academy, that's what I found. You have certain kids that they're already locked into the type of person they are, what they want to do, what they're interested in, and then you have people that are just kind of still exploring and trying to figure out what that is. A good example of that is, and that's why the one room schoolhouse it was so impressive to me, is because we had one kid who just wanted to be a filmmaker. He just loved making films, and he's doing all sorts of cool effects and like makeup and blood makeup and stuff. Um, but what I realize is that if you have one of those, and then you have a bunch of people that don't quite know, those other people can come along and support what he's doing. And in turn, they could start discovering things about themselves, things that they like, because he was just one kid, but he had a group of like most of the school supporting his project. So some of them were acting, some of them were holding boom mics, and helping him edit or whatever. So he basically built a crew out of all these other students to help support his vision, and they went joyfully, and they were starting to discover things about themselves. They were starting to get confidence being in front of a camera, speaking, learning lines, um, or editing, doing the technical things to support the project. So I think that's an important part of that all parents should kind of know is that if you have that kid that knows exactly what he's doing, that's great. But you may have that other kid that has to search life and figure out what it is he's trying to be. And that's kind of where Benny is, and a lot of the common public school question is like, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up, right? Um, I've kind of like just taken that out of my vernacular just because it's more about, okay, Benny, you're very uh, you're very empathetic, you're very strategic. Um, People love Benny. When he comes into the room, he just lights up the room. So instead of looking at how we can match him up with some job, I'm looking at, okay, this is who you are, and eventually you're going to find your way into the types of things that match who you are rather than, like being forced into something that you think you should be doing. I just know so many young people that have gone down a path, whether it's medicine or law or, some just to be impressive. And then they realize that, wait a minute, this is not what I want to do. Some of them just want to be a parent, so they've gone down this long path because they thought they needed to, or they wanted to be impressive. And then they realize, wait a minute, I wasted all this time because I'm way back there where I should have started exploring a lot of different things. And that's what Alpha is for our kid. In fact, I've told them like the academics are fine. We got that covered. But I'm really here for Benny to figure out who he is. So that's the priority, and I think they have a good format for that, with their workshops and their projects. So that's why we're there.
So, Gabriel, you are an entrepreneur. Not only did you start a microschool, but you've been running Mentor Wings Art for a long time, a small business owner, someone who's, maybe eager to experiment or think differently about education and the way things are always done, right? And try something new and different. But what would you say to parents who might not be, sort of on that same playing field at the moment? If they're feeling a little bit more concerned, worried, stressed about making a switch, particularly into unconventional education, into a new school like Alpha or into homeschooling and different kind of models. What do you say to sort of provide some encouragement to parents who might not be so willing to jump into the new as you are and were?
Yeah, I was just looking up a valedictorian speech before we started here. It's by Erica Goldson. She's a valedictorian, and it's on YouTube. Um, but she actually, her speech is a condemnation of the public schooling system, because she realized that she spent all this time striving for these goals, that actually kept her from discovering who she was. And that's one of the things I'm worried about Benny is like, okay, Alpha, yes, you have huge scores, you have great, SAT scores and stuff like that, but I don't want the academics to cloud out, you know, trying to figure out who you are. So it's a very compelling speech, and it's by somebody that's credible. She did the work, she experienced it, and then she's talking about, the artists that were discovering who they were, the musicians, the people that are exploring, rather than kind of like being locked into a preset program by the government, or by things that we think you should be doing, checking off a list and so I think that's the main thing. In fact, I had one family leave my academy after the first week, because they were locked into that idea that, oh, he's going to get behind because he didn't do all his math, this week. Um, so um, I think I think the problem with the traditional public school thinking is like there's a gentleman's agreement from everybody. We don't care if you learn any of this stuff. We just want you to get the grades. We want you to check the boxes. We want you to go to the next step. Um, but being somebody who actually loved learning, you can see the difference between the two. Um, in fact, I tell a story, and I think I was in 11th grade. One of my teachers had a contest, and he he would ask questions. It was all about aviation or the Wright brothers and things like that. And I was failing school. I was failing high school, but I won that competition. I was the first in the class because I was always reading stuff. I had a huge encyclopedia. I would flip through it almost every day, just learning something different. Um, and I realized much later on, because at the time I didn't have the perspective of an adult, that I was loving learning and I was actually learning things. And the people that were checking off the boxes, they weren't actually learning anything. They were just kind of going through the process, and it just seemed like a gigantic waste of time for me. Um, so I think that's one thing you can start evaluating in your own kid is like, are they actually learning something, or are they just going through the motions and doing things that I'm telling them to do, which is mostly what public school is. Not only that, but just learning things that matter and learning how to think. Um, we throw this word around critical thinking a lot, right? And that can mean something different to everybody. Most people, it means that person should think like I think, and that's critical thinking. But real critical thinking is be able to just see a lot of different things and make connections between them, and use those things practically in life to just build things. Um, And even though I've failed high school, I've, I was able to take those skills of making connections, and I've been in video games, I've been in high tech, I've been in educational multimedia. It hasn't stopped. I built schools, it hasn't stopped anything. In fact, I actually built math curriculum for a while, and from the perspective of a failing student. So I was able to actually take my experience from as a failing student and make that product much better because I actually cared that the students didn't get lost and that they were able to actually make something out of that software. Um, so yeah, you have to get out of the mindset of public schools. Um, Otherwise, you'll go through the motions and you'll have your degree. You might even go all the way through college and still be lost as to what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and really just appreciating the difference between education and schooling.
Right,
I think that's one thing that your story represents is you can maybe make it through 12, 13 years of a conventional school environment and be well schooled, but not necessarily well educated.
right.
And that, sort of self-education or encouraging students to reach their full potential often happens outside of a conventional classroom and it can happen. And that's why we have so many more of these alternative learning models. So maybe one thing that I often think about and talk to families about is you don't have to commit necessarily to an unconventional approach to education forever for all of K to 12 schooling. You could just try it for now and see how it goes and then make a change. And I think even within the unconventional education space, you can make changes. And that's what you've been able to demonstrate with both of your kids, that you're not locked in to one approach. And right now, for example, Alpha School is working for your 15-year-old, but I imagine that if it didn't, you would look for something else, right? It's sort of that flexibility. I wonder if that's how you approach this as well.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, we've even talked about it. I don't know if you're familiar with Praxis. It's
Yeah.
kind of an alternative, college alternative. Because Benny told me, I just want to work. I just want to go to
Mm.
work. I want to start working. And I was like, okay, well, there's programs that do that. So we've actually talked about, Praxis because I know they've let in 16-year-olds at some point. But they have to be very driven, and kind of fit their program. So that is something even now we're anticipating maybe we need to change at some point. It would be cool if he stayed there, if he was able to finish all the way through because, uh, but if he needs to change, he needs to change, and we're willing to do that. So yeah, we're willing to turn on a dime to get him where he needs to be. Um, so yeah, it's very much focused on him and where he needs to be and who he is, rather than fulfilling external requirements of anybody else. So,
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Praxis. It's discoverpraxis.com,
yeah.
a long time apprenticeship program and kind of alternative to college for young people, including many homeschoolers and those in the unconventional education space, but not exclusively. And Praxis was just recently taken over by the LiberatED network. So now kind of a part of that ecosystem as well. So lots of things happening in terms of alternative education in the K-12 sector, as well as kind of post high school, providing multiple pathways to adulthood for young people today. So, sort of parting wisdom, parting encouragement, Gabriel, for other parents listening around thinking about more alternatives to conventional schooling.
Yeah, for both of my sons, I was always on the lookout for something, you know, something they're interested in, their personalities, um, the intangible things that you can't test. And when I find something like that, I just pour fuel on the fire. I remember Benny was about to be born, and I bought a camcorder, and all I did was I was just testing it, panning it around the room, and I panned it towards Micah, and he started making a video like on the spot. He started giving me a tutorial on how to build a flamingo
Mm.
out of clay, and he was articulating it clearly, and he was making a show out of it, and I was like, okay. We have not stopped making videos since that day.
Wow.
Yeah, he had a channel. Benny was on it for a little bit, uh, talking about toys and video games, and then he ended up doing his stop motion channel later. He's been making videos since he was 6 years old. Um, and all I did was pour fuel on the fire. I gave him the tools. I bought him a little iPod Touch with a camera so he could make his own videos. I would sit there and film them for him, while he was talking. Um, I didn't create that. I didn't make that. It was something he had in him. And I just poured fuel on the fire by giving them the tools and the encouragement to keep going with it. Um, so look out for those intangibles that, the politicians can't checkbox, right? Because that's where most likely your kid's real self is. And that's what I'm looking for both of my kids, and even my students. I do the same thing. Uh, I have a self-directed philosophy even in my art school. So I try not to tamper down anything that might uh, actually like elevate them and make them grow even faster. Um, so I think that's the key point that I did. And just, you can just evaluate if they're actually loving learning versus just checking off the boxes that you're giving them. When I went to art school, I had a philosophy book and I had a physics book with me, uh, just because for fun. Um, and through that, I ended up meeting a professor of physics. Um, and then through that, I ended up meeting another professor of theology at Princeton. So I was 19 years old, hobnobbing with, you know, Ivy League professors just because I loved it. So if you think that the credibility is going to come through the documentation or the certifications, it's not. It's really more about what you care about, and just making those connections with the other people that are interested in what you're interested in. In fact, that's how I met you. So yeah, in
Yes,
fact,
yeah.
I remember writing you a letter because I read one of your articles. Like, she's writing everything that I'm thinking, so I don't have to write these articles anymore. So, so now I just let you write the articles.
Well, we'd still love to see your writing too, Gabriel.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
glad
yeah,
you're working with students and encouraging other families to consider alternatives to the schooling status quo and consider education beyond standard schooling. Such great words of advice and encouragement today, Gabriel Valles. Thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
sure. It's my pleasure.